Let's talk about modern prophecy standards and the Jewish understanding of prophecy. In particular, let's talk about the Gospel of Matthew and the phrase, so that Scripture might be fulfilled. When we read the Gospels and see phrases like, so that the Scripture might be fulfilled, most of us automatically hear it through a modern lens. We imagine prophecy working like a supernatural weather forecast. Someone predicts a specific future event, and later it happens exactly that way. Fulfillment in that model means a prediction came true. But that's not the only way the Bible uses the word fulfilled, and it's not even the clearest place to start. The easiest place to recalibrate our thinking is Jesus' own words in Matthew 5:17. When Jesus says he came not to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them, no one thinks he means the law was making predictions about him, and he checked them off later. We naturally understand it to mean that Jesus brought the law and the prophets to their full measure. He lived them out, carried them through, and brought their meaning to completion in his life and mission. That sense of fulfill as bring to fullness or bring to completion is built into the Greek word itself. It comes from the idea of filling something up until it reaches its proper measure. That's a normal Greek idea, not a special religious trick. Now here's the key move. Matthew uses that same word, fulfilled, when he talks about Scripture being fulfilled in Jesus' life. Sometimes that does look like a straightforward prophecy, but many times, when you look back at the Old Testament passage Matthew is quoting, it wasn't a prediction at all. Sometimes it's a lament. Sometimes it's about Israel's past. Sometimes it's a psalm about suffering or betrayal. No one reading those passages originally would have said, this is predicting a future event or a specific individual. So what is Matthew doing? Matthew is reading Scripture the way Jews in his world commonly did. They didn't treat Scripture as a list of isolated predictions. They treated it as a living story and a shared vocabulary. Certain patterns kept showing up in Israel's history. Deliverance, exile, betrayal by close friends, suffering followed by vindication. Those patterns became ways of recognizing what God was doing again later. So when Matthew says Scripture was fulfilled, he often means something like this. An old scriptural pattern has appeared again, and this time it has reached its fullest and clearest expression. That doesn't cancel the original meaning. It builds on it. A psalm written by David meant something real in David's life, but it could also speak again when a later righteous sufferer walked the same path. Scripture wasn't exhausted the first time it was used. This matters a lot when we talk about Judas. Many people assume that if Scripture was fulfilled in Judas's betrayal, then Judas must have been destined from birth to betray Jesus. But that conclusion doesn't come from the text itself. It comes from importing a prediction-only model of fulfillment. The Old Testament passages about betrayal are not secret predictions about Judas. They are expressions of a painful but recurring human experience, being betrayed by someone close. When the Gospels apply those passages to Judas, they're saying, this ancient pattern has shown up again in the most serious way imaginable. That's a claim about meaning and correspondence, not about God scripting Judas's actions in advance. Notice how Jesus treats Judas. He warns him. He appeals to him. He pronounces woe over his choices. That language only makes sense if Judas is being treated as a responsible, moral agent in real time, not as someone acting out a role he cannot escape. Some people respond by saying, Well, Matthew had special divine insight, and now we can see that all those passages were actually hidden predictions. But that move creates more problems than it solves. It turns Scripture into a secret code no one could understand until after the fact, and it makes moral responsibility hard to explain. It also isn't necessary because Matthew's way of reading Scripture already fits well within known Jewish interpretive habits. In short, the problem isn't Scripture. The problem is how modern readers often assume prophecy has to work. The New Testament writers were not trying to prove God's existence by prediction statistics. They were telling the story of Jesus as the climax of Israel's Scripture-shaped story. Fulfillment in that world is about completion and fullness, not just foresight. Once we see that, a lot of tension disappears. Fulfillment doesn't require fatalism. Scripture can be meaningful without being a fortune-telling manual, and Jesus' life can stand at the center of the biblical story without turning every human choice into a pre-written script. That is the world Matthew was living in, and once you step into that frame, the text starts to make a lot more sense.